Welcome to everyone. Welcome to our participants and panelists. Welcome to what is the fourth in our series of global salons on critical topics this year. In the last 2 months, February, March, in the last couple of months, we've had fantastic cross-disciplinary, cross-regional perspectives on some key topics. We've talked about future cities, democratic challenges and change, and inequality and social justice. And we're very excited for this conversation this morning on migrations and mobilities. This is a topic clearly, by definition, migrations and mobilities, that needs to be addressed from multiple locations, from an interdisciplinary and global perspective, where you have regional and specific locations with all of their place-based histories and contexts. So we're really pleased to have panelists here today from our global hub partners across the world. The global hubs are Cornell University's strategic partners in various locations around the world, partners with whom we're building educational, research, and engagement exchanges in order to address some of the most challenging and some of the most important, and in some cases, some of the most exciting questions in front of us. So thank you to everyone for organizing and participating, and thank you to Rachel Riedel and the Einaudi team for hosting these salons.
Thank you, Wendy. Thanks to all of our participants and panelists for being here to help us start this conversation, which we very much hope is a continuing one. And thank you to our audience members for being here. We hope that you will share your questions and ideas, your reactions, your own research links and projects in the Q&A function. We will use those questions and inputs to further the conversation after we've gone through each of our panelists' introductions, in order to really allow the engagement of our audience and also to be able to build upon going forward after the salon. So please don't hesitate to use that as a springboard for the potentials of collaboration that you in the audience might see as well. I want to be very brief because we have so much to cover today, but I want to just briefly explain the charge that we've given each of our panelists, which is to do 3 things today. First is to briefly introduce themselves and their work. Second is to share information from across their universities so that we have a sense of how things might connect, centers and projects and possibilities for collaboration. And then third is to engage in a kind of thought project around what is the future research agenda of this topic? What are the cutting edge questions? Where are we going? What is the space around which we would be excited to collaborate? So that I hope will be very inspiring for all of us and also surely point out how much work we yet have to do. So with that, I want to start out with our first panelist, Shannon Gleason from Cornell University. Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you, Rachel, for the great introduction. I'm going to use my time today to just briefly give you a sense of the work that I'm engaged in here at Cornell. I am a professor in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations. I'm a sociologist by training, and I also co-direct our Migrations Initiative. My work generally focuses on the role of immigrant rights mobilization, and I'm particularly interested in comparative research at the local level. Several of my research projects have done interviews and other ethnographic research paired with surveys to understand how immigrants are mobilizing their rights on the ground. A lot of my work focuses on state-society relations, especially the role of civil society and other meso-level institutions, and kind of moving beyond thinking about immigrant policy to also understanding the implementation process and the nitty-gritty of those processes on the ground. I've also looked at the very precarious experience of many, especially undocumented migrant workers, and in my latest book, the increasing importance of the sending state or origin country. As a part of my work here on campus, I'm also, as I mentioned, the co-director of our Migrations Initiative. And just to tell you a little bit about one of our recent programs, we were awarded generous funding from the Mellon Just Futures initiatives to focus really on the role of migration alongside racism and dispossession, asking ourselves, what can we learn about the extant theories of racialization, as well as indigeneity and dispossession, not only of land, but of culture and other forms of society building. We've provided grants in the areas such as research, pedagogy, and engagement. We are really thrilled to have hosted at least 3 postdocs. We have ongoing fora for exchange, both amongst our early career scholars and other guests who are coming in. We have upcoming programming with our Johnson Art Museum that I encourage everyone to keep an eye out for. And we're really thrilled to be doing some outreach to our colleagues here at community colleges. This summer, we'll have a couple of institutes for early career scholars, as well as a pipeline program for undergraduates. Our students now are in about their 4th year of pursuing a migration minor on campus, and we're really excited to see where our other degree granting programs in the migration sphere might emerge and how we might be able to collaborate with other colleagues across the globe, such as yourself. Finally, when I was asked to think about, what an agenda for migrations and mobility looks like, I think I'd focus on 4 brief points. One, I think, especially in US-based sociology and in North America, kind of moving beyond simply thinking about assimilation or integration frameworks. I've also been interested in thinking through how we can leverage multi-sided research and comparative work, not only internally, but also across national borders. I really think that any kind of research agenda focused on immigration enforcement should also look at carceral studies and the role of state terror and policing practices as they influence immigration enforcement. And finally, I would say a move towards an intersectional lens, not only thinking about migration and immigrant identity, but also race and gender inequality. So I really look forward to hearing about everybody else's work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gleason. That's a really wonderful overview and really puts a lot on the table for us to grapple with. Next, we'll have Dr. Liani Ansems-de Vries from King's College London.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Yes, it's me, and Helen is here too. She's now 4 months old. Right, so yes, I'm a reader in international politics at King's College London, and I'm also the chair of the Migration Research Group and the co-director of the King's Sanctuary Programme. And what I want to speak about is some of the research that's going on across King's, as well as a broader impact agenda on migration and displacement. And sort of some of the key questions that have informed my own research over the past decade, but more widely as well at King's, is quite theoretically, what is a border, but also sort of practically, what does it do? And really, what are the experiences of people that are forced to move? And then finally, in response to that, like, how can we develop safe and legal pathways for people that are forcibly displaced? And we're especially interested at the moment in education-led pathways through universities. My own research has been geographically located in Southeast Asia and Europe. Other King's researchers focus on other parts of the world, really across the globe. So if I go back to the question of what a border is not just a territorial line or a geographical location, but a technique of governance, right? Often takes place outside state territory, so through visa regime, for instance, as well as dispersed throughout society. And that means that borders are often very violent, that are designed to be violent. And one of the things I've done is develop the notion of a politics of exhaustion in the context of this misnamed European refugee crisis, to really capture both governmental practices to make migrants' lives difficult, but also the kind of lived experience of being subjected to the kind of border violence. And the notion of sort of an intersectional analysis that was brought forward in the previous presentation, I think, is really important there as well. So what does it mean? It means that people are illegalized because they do not have access to the right papers. They do not have access to safe and regular routes. So we really want to think not just theoretically, but also sort of in policy terms, what can we do actually to make those kind of routes accessible to people that are seeking safety. So this is what we've been doing at King's, sort of in research-wise, but also through the King's Sanctuary Programme, and that's sort of been the King's response to the issue of forced displacement worldwide. And we have a number of projects, for instance, in the Middle East and elsewhere as well. So foundation programs for students to enter higher education. And we've also become the first university in the UK to resettle a refugee family, so from the Syrian war to the UK, and sort of create this kind of educational pathway. And the eldest daughter will start a degree at King's in September, which is fantastic. And then what we now want to do, we're now sort of trying to encourage and support other universities to also do this. And currently we're working on that in relation to Ukraine, to create a safe legal pathway for education. For those students. So in terms of our future research, and collaborative efforts, I would say really thinking about legal pathways and safe pathways globally would be the first point. And secondly, thinking about border violence and migrant experiences intersectionally. And I would go further and just speak about race and gender, but also ableism, because that really is, I think, a key point that's often missed. So that's where I'd be interested in going. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Leonie. That's really fascinating and very much in line with the Summer Institute that Dr. Gleason mentioned as well, in terms of thinking about pathways for students to enter higher education. Next, we'll go to Dr. Joseph Profite from University of Ghana.
Thank you so much. So I am the director of the Center for Migration Studies at the University of Ghana. I'm also an associate professor of migration and development at the Department of Geography and Resource Development. I'll briefly highlight a few of the researches that I've been involved in. So I'm involved in a number of researches. One of the areas that I've been researching recently is migration and poverty outcomes. I was part of the Migrating Out of Poverty, and since then we've been working on understanding the circumstances under which migration can be used as a strategy to move out of poverty. Then I've also been involved in the research on South-South migration inequality and the development, which is one of the largest migration projects currently. And in this research, we are looking at the relationship between migration and inequality and how migration can be used to deal with inequality issues. I've also been conducting research on climate-induced mobility. So there is a project that is also funded by Danida, where we are looking at how climate change contributes to migration and how migration can be used to build climate resilience. And then last but one area I've been looking at is migration and social transformation. Most of the earlier researches have tended to focus on the economic aspects of migration, and we are thinking non-economic aspects such as social change can also contribute to migration. Migration can contribute to some of these things. So we've been conducting research on that. I've been involved in migration policy issues also, having helped to develop migration policies in a number of African countries. The bigger university in which I come from, University of Ghana, has several interdisciplinary centers that work on migration, poverty-related issues, and they all collaborate with us at the Center for Migration Studies, which is an interdisciplinary center. We've collaborated with a number of agencies, ECOWAS, IOM, EU, ICMPD, and several universities. And I see a possibility of collaboration in several areas. We can collaborate to design possible proposal with actors here, also academic exchange and capacity building. Lastly, one thing I will talk about is the future of migration research. So based on what we are doing at the moment, I think one area that has to be looked at is the area of South-South migration. It seems most of the studies focus on South-North migration. And here we do know about 60% move within the global South. So South-South migration and how it can contribute to reduction in inequality is one area we can collaborate. Then also the issue of immobilities. Most of the researchers are focusing on those who migrate, but our climate exchange researchers have shown that, for instance, there are so many people who are unable to move as a result of even when they have climate change, they don't have any resources to help them to move. So we should be focusing also on those who are not able to move, the immobile populations. So immobilities and the several aspects and factors that contribute to immobility is one area that we could look at. And then finally, migration and social transformation relationship. How does migration contribute to social transformation at origins? And how does social transformation itself also contribute to migration? These are issues that I think we can collaborate to look at. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tay. Those are really fantastic dimensions that you've laid out and correspond with our focus as well on inequality and intersectional identities. Next, we'll move to Dr. Rutia Bulaor from Chulalongkorn University.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'd like to share my slide, my presentation. Okay, first of all, I'd like to introduce myself and my own work. Actually, I'm quite covered in many issues, including migration and migrations, would be about the migrants' rights, about the migration and sustainable development, as well as climate changes and aging societies that are related to migrations. But I'm also responsible for the Collaborating Center for Labor Research at Chulalongkorn University as a key coordinator. So that I'm quite into labor market skills, in particular on decent work, skill development, youth need, and older persons as well as gender. But actually in Chulalongkorn University, we have many centers and college, as well as a platform that we involve migration as a key issue in Chulalongkorn. So we have the ASEAN Research Center for Migrations. We have the College of Population Studies, in which I'm the vice dean here. And we have the Social Research Institute, focusing on well-being of migrant workers, and also among others with other social research, as well as a labor research platform, which trying to highlight at once the cost-cutting domain of labor migrant-related issues. So if we talk in a whole, in terms of collaboration, I think we have numbers of issues that we can cover, like network, frontier research, and policy linkage that we can link from Chulalongkorn and from myself as a coordinator to my colleagues as well. But you know, like, but for the possible future research, it could, from my own perspective, be about the migrants' rights and their well-being, the gender migrations, and in particular on the migration and sustainable development, in which I also have a paper in that. And migration and climate changes, including something related to pandemics and its impacts, as well as the migration and aging societies, in which the countries in Southeast Asia have been very concerned on that issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bulaor. Those are really fantastic points that you make. And I just want to connect the point that you made on migration and aging societies. Aging societies is also a topic that really came up in our salon on future cities, and thinking about the infrastructure from rural to urban migration, but also out migration from cities as the populations become older. So I'd really love to connect that conversation across panelists as well. Next, we'll go to Dr. Kristen Davalos from Universidad San Francisco de Quito.
Hello to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for this wonderful invitation and to share our work in Quito, Ecuador, Universidad San Francisco de Quito, which is in South America. I'm Dean of the School of Social Studies and Humanities at the university, and also Professor of International Relations. I wanted to just briefly set out some of my research projects and recent publications. Some are only mine, and others are in collaboration with other colleagues. Mostly the issues that I've been working on in the past years in terms of research are gender-based violence. We have a project on the Galapagos Islands and gender-based violence. So we talk about feminist geography and insular contexts. And this is going into a second phase, which we're just starting, and we're sort of changing into a political ecology perspective on the Galapagos Islands. This is because we found that 70% of the women that we surveyed on San Cristobal Island before the pandemic found that the women's rights are below the rights of the environment. So in terms of animals and other sort of fauna and flora that lives on the Galapagos Islands. So we're changing to perspective to combine a gender perspective with a political ecology perspective and combine environment versus human rights. I also have been working on human migration in Latin America. Recently, I have a publication from in Gender, Place, and Culture about Ecuadorian migration in Spain. And this is a localized, it's a triple context sort of research in terms of Ecuadorians in Spain and their integration and work experiences, then a transnational view, and then also a local view of the people who are left behind in the country of origin and how families live in different nations and spaces. This leads me to then, in the recent years, we've seen a huge Venezuelan migration or south-to-south migration in Latin America, and Ecuador has been part of that migration. In that sense, we've received about 500,000 of Venezuelans, and it's a very interesting migration because it's a circular migration. And so our attention has been started to focus on the Venezuelan migration in Latin America. In addition, we're looking at a project, which is a very large project with funds from Canada on migration and food security, looking also at the migrant population. So those are the two sort of focuses in terms of migration. Then I also have research on mobility in the city of Quito, which is from a gender perspective. And on the right side, I put all the most recent publications in case any of you want to read up on those. Then we saw with our colleagues that we've been working on these issues of gender migration. We thought that there's a very important need to institutionalize these issues in our country and in our university. And so we just recently founded, so we're learning, and it'll be interesting to hear from all your experience of how to institutionalize these ideas and these collaborations, both nationally and internationally. We founded the Institute for Advanced Studies and Inequalities. Here you can see our mission and objective, and we're working mostly on gender, territory, human mobility, political ecology, and ancestral knowledge, and always from a global south perspective, a critical perspective using decolonial methodologies. At the bottom, I put a QR in case you want to go directly to our webpage. And I just wanted to briefly show you who is working, collaborating with me recently. Cheryl Martins, she's the director, and then Sofia Saragossin, she's in charge of gender and territory for the Institute. I'm third, my picture Kristen, and I'm working on human mobility. And Antonia Carcelin, who's participated in other of these hubs, is working on as a coordinator of oral histories. And there you have our emails in case anyone wants to email or contact us. We have we're looking to collaborate. We're looking for to work jointly, internationally and locally. Then leading to the final question to wrap up quickly, I just sort of want to echo what my other colleagues from the Global South have been mentioning. It's very important to produce research from the Global South, the South to South migration, because most of the research has been from South to North. So we're learning a lot about these new sort of migrations, not new, but sort of seeing different nuances in terms of the migration South to South. Some of the themes that we're working on is food security, environmental change, violence, state fragility as drivers of migration, which are really important to consider in terms of South to South migration. We also integrate, we're very important issues for us, our gender and racial perspectives from the Global South, sorry. And when I speak of gender, I'm not only talking about a female perspective, but we're trying to also integrate sexual diversity and masculinities into our conversations. And also the links of migration to the development processes of our countries. That's something that we're lacking, and that's very important. And finally, how to enter the public debates. This is something that we public policy and how to integrate all these issues of gender, race, and migration and food insecurity into the public debates is something that we really need to work on in Latin America. Thank you very much. This is my email in case anyone wants to collaborate and contact me in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kristen. That's so wonderful. And, again, just so many points of synergy and connection. One of the things that we have here is a Global Public Voices Program Fellows program where our faculty are encouraged and trained to write policy briefs and op-eds and the like, and in that way, you know, really engage in the conversation on that level, as Dr. Tai was explaining as well, his role in some of the African countries and thinking about migration policy. So that's also an area of great interest. Next, we'll move to Dr. Siu Chang from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology.
Hello, let me share my screen first. I'm so happy to be here. Wonderful opportunity for sharing. Let me see. This is my slide here. Okay. I'm an anthropology by training, affiliated with the Division of Humanities at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. I'm also the Vice Director of Associate Director of the South China Center, South China Research Center. And South China has always been the region about people on the move, through history and in the current situation of development too. Let me talk about 3 of my ongoing projects. One is about the Miao people, the ethnic group being running all the way freeing the Chinese empire during its expansion. And I mainly focus on their levities about the historical migration. Throughout the history of migration, they finally settled in southwestern part of China, in Guizhou, Yunnan. And well, my question is, how the native identity and otherness exist between escape and assimilation? Some scholars like James Scott promoted the idea of an escape model, talking about some stateless people, all the way freeing the state rule, giving up the opportunity of developing identities in order to escape from the domination. And then there are other scholars talking about the assimilation model, so that the Chinese empire expands itself by assimilation other people. But my question is about how the Miao people, by making use of appropriating Chinese conception of the Miao as a kind of otherness, so that they make use of this to develop their identity in the nation building project and being incorporated as a minority people in the Chinese nation in modern time. And this is the work of ongoing project of cultural appropriation, politics of appropriation, otherness, how these things work out in the process of intercultural exchange between the dominating people and the people under domination. Another project also related to the Miao people, well, addressing the past 2 decades of migration, being migrant workers from their home place inland province in Guizhou to the coastal area in Pearl River Delta, rapidly developing hubs of manufacturing industry. And there are almost 200,000 people, the Miao people, who settle in this place. And then my investigation is about how they form their migrant association and the role of migrant association in establishing social level linkage among themselves, and then institutional embeddedness with the host society. And making this establishment, they play the role as a conduit, channeling labor, capital, and culture between their home place and the whole society. In this work, I emphasizing the cultural connection and the institutional connection between the migrant people with their home place, and also the interaction between the home place and the whole society. So this is about the in-kind consciousness of Afro-cultural identity, expressed through their festivals and under the work of the Migrant Association. And so this tells about how festivals build their linkage, institutional embeddedness, and so that they can play the role of the conduits to channel labor, capital, and culture. Another project is about Hakka village in Hong Kong, a very tiny village on an island. And it has been famous for getting 2 awards from UNESCO for heritage conversation. One is about the Catholic Church on the island. They settled here almost 300 years, and then they started being converted to Catholicism about 150 years ago. And then another piece of heritage work is the soft pen for seesaw production. And well, when I conduct an oral history research project on the migrant workers from this island who settled in the UK in the 1960s, and they brought up their second generation who born overseas. This second generation developed their home place imagination in terms of invented tradition in Hong Kong's publicized rural heritage conservation, so that their imagination of home place identity contrasting very interestingly with their parents' migrant identity based on memory of rural life in their home village. So that these are the home place memory of the first generation overseas migrants in old photos. And then another one, well, is a YouTube video produced by second generation migrants who was born overseas. And then his visit to the home village mainly focused on the heritage project, so that he played with it and filmed the project about the church, about the soft pans, and about the display room of the Hakka culture. So, well, local heritage has become the symbols of homeland for overseas migrants in their homeland imagination, especially for the young generation who did not grow up in the village. So these are my 3 ongoing projects. And some of the work of my colleagues, like Chang, Professor Chang, whose work is about the Korean War criminals, Korean War prisoners who chose to move to some neutral countries instead of going back to China. And well, from China to Korea to India and then Latin America. His work tracked their migration process and their agency in determining their location to move. And Professor Kelly Chai, belonging to the Global Center, her work focused on the international in the cultural communities in India and China, and pay attention to the local society's relations with their migrant identity and interactions. So she investigated the impacts of, for example, for remittance and return migration, shaking the relationship with the state. And some of my colleagues examined the cross-border marriage in Hong Kong, between Hong Kong and China and some other places. And Professor David Wright, examining the employment of overseas returnees in China. So these are also interesting work related to migration in relation to Hong Kong, China, and India across the regions. Well, based on my own research, yes.
Dr. Chang, thank you so much. Thank you for that. And I think there are many connections between these works and the climate mobility and labor connections that our other panelists have made. We'll also distribute all of the slides so that we have a chance to share their future research ideas as well. And please bring those back into the Q&A. Thank you so much. Next, we have Dr. Amanda Rodewald from Cornell University.
Great. Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to be here with you. Let's get the show going. So I'm an ecologist and a conservation biologist, and I study how global change affects species and systems. And then I use that information to try to improve our ability to conserve biodiversity and ecosystem services. So I direct the Center for Avian Population Studies at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And there we work with partners to provide some of the world's largest collections of biodiversity data. And we produce those data assets using citizen science and also innovative technologies like weather radar and bioacoustic monitoring, and then move them into action through our science, our partnerships, and our outreach and education programs. So to give you some examples of the kinds of data I'm talking about, I can show you this example here. It's an animation of the migration of the barn swallow over the course of a year. So we're able to take our over 1 billion observations of birds that have been submitted by citizen scientists around the world to eBird, our platform, and we can model the distribution and abundance of birds at weekly intervals, like you see here. So obviously this is really useful if we're studying birds, but it's also helpful to look at how bird migration might connect to other aspects of human health and well-being, as well as using this for conservation. Here I'm showing two other kinds of data we use. So on the left, you're seeing an animation that shows bird migration on the night of October 3rd of this last fall. We're able to produce that using weather radar, and then we can extract information about birds. So that information, of course, good for studying birds, but it also can be used to do things like reduce collisions with birds, with buildings, or with aircrafts, or other ways they might act as vectors of disease. On the right, you're looking at an example of our bioacoustic data and how we can use that, in this case, to track individual movements of animals. So whales you can see in the small dots and ships in the larger ones. And so, overall, I think although these data resources make possible lots of exciting ecological studies, they also really open the doors to some exciting interdisciplinary work that we're very interested to pursue, with colleagues around the world and global hub partners. And those kinds of questions might include how the movements of birds can affect food security via how they affect crops, or how the bird-based ecotourism and the distribution of birds might affect revenue streams to rural livelihoods, how we can use migration information to reduce collisions between aircraft and birds, and even understanding too how birds might be acting as vectors of disease for other animals. So we'd be really happy to explore these and other kinds of questions with our Global Hub partners. Thanks a lot for tuning in today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rodewald. Fantastic. Next, we'll go to Deepan Shoemoham from Jindal Global University.
Hi, this is wonderful. I'll get started right away, just with a few minutes in hand. I'm here to talk a little bit about a methodological and a pedagogical experiment that we've sort of got into over the last couple of years. My training is an economic historian, but I've been working on issues around development studies for a while. And what we've been trying to do is inculcate or incubate a culture of trying to visually use anthropological tools to archive the field work that we have been doing. Now, which touches upon areas of migration and mobility studies, but what we've been largely doing is been trying to narrativize livelihoods of what we call as floating worker populations, largely those working in the informal, unorganized sector, different communities, and I'll come to which communities we have specifically worked on. But the effort has been largely as a concentrated objective has been to study the invisibilization of work amongst vulnerable groups over a period of time. Now, what is the conceptual sort of contribution that we're trying to aim at is to develop what would be considered as an inclusive framework to understanding issues around urban informality, but they're not concentrated only to urban areas. As Rachel pointed out earlier, there's a triangulated geography of rural, semi-urban, urban areas where you're looking at people moving from across these areas. So what Visual Storyboard does is that we produce what you would consider as different photo, video essays to try bringing out narratives and communications of the voices of respondents, rather than not just restrict to research papers or journal articles, which is as important as they are, sometimes do not change the lives of the communities we are engaging with. These are some of the research questions I put out there, but as the presentation will be shared, I think you'll get a deeper insight on the kind of interventions we've been trying to look at. We've very closely worked on Karl Polanyi's concept of embeddedness and tried to study it in context to craft, ethnic participation of the role of sociocultural profile of communities and their economic livelihood. But in the questions around migration, we're trying to look at motivations that make communities mobile. Why are men and women and different members of other gendered group communities moving so often as they are? And despite the pandemic, which caused a huge crisis back in India, which has a largely informal workforce, how has this affected their own lives and livelihoods? We're also looking at questions of intra-household gender relations for identified communities, and there's a lot of work that has come out, which has been published now, that one can get a sense. What I'd try to do is just give you a very quick snapshot of a few studies we've recently completed. And the idea, as I said, was initially to just document and get a sense of what these communities are experiencing with a basic insight into their intra and inter-household circumstances. But the axes of research that have emerged from the work that we did have given us an idea about looking at issues of deunionization, asymmetric gendered power relations, and weakening worker agency. Now, all of this may be a core center in the field of development economics, but when you look at the intersectionality and the application of that, I think there's a lot of scope to be done. This is just to give you a sense of a community we work with. This is a 500,000 migrant worker based, located at the Delhi-Gurgaon border in the north, the capital of India. Largely uncovered. There's hardly any research that has been done there because it's a very difficult area to navigate. The communities there are staying in sort of subhuman conditions, but have created their own informal solidarity networks and have tried to make a living over a period of time. There are issues of housing, rental arrangements that we've tried to study. We're still doing that. It takes a while, but last 2 years we've been trying to work in this area. There are a lot of issues around class, access to basic amenities, which we have figured that are closely concentrated with where you work and where is that where people stay. And this has a lot to do where, in terms of gendered power relations, access to drinking water and sanitation facilities is an important factor. So just some images that will give you a sense of the nature of work. These are water meters. So there's no state presence of providing access to water as close as to the National Capital Region. This was a study which focused on daily wage workers. And I very quickly want to scan through some of the images where we are looking at the role and relevance of informal labor markets, places where workers come, travel 4 hours a day in the morning, and they try to look for a job, largely in the construction area, on an ad hoc informal contract on a daily wage. Most of them are largely men, but there are stories of women that we've tried to articulate in the video essays that have come out. Particularly, this issue was important in COVID, the pandemic-induced lockdown. India had the largest, most severe form of lockdown, and it's regressed these communities back by almost a decade. And I'm understating the claim right here. A lot of work that we've quantified now have tried to sort of bring out some of these facts. Children, women have definitely been affected, but if you look at nomadic communities, those working in the circus, hand-cut steel workers, we've looked at all of these communities over a period of time. Finally, the degrees of embeddedness of craft with the way in which textile workers operate, those we may brand and commercialize in export houses, but the tragedy is of the workers who are engaged in the craft and the sort of desperate situations that they've been working in. So we've tried to look at different kinds of craft substance, largely in the state of Rajasthan, within Jaipur. Most of this craft is largely produced by women and has almost 85% of household women working in producing the craft. Finally, just the communities we have been working on, from street vendors to sex workers in red light districts to ethnic minorities. Dr. Chang's presentation was fascinating because we worked with the Cham community in Cambodia, which is also an area that we've tried to collaborate our work. Issue is funding. Resources is a big problem, but we've tried to sort of do some pilot studies in those areas. There were right-affected victims whose testimonies we also got, which closely brought out into the issues of migration over a period of time. Finally, just to tell, for those who are attending this deliberation, we're very keen to build collaborative partnerships. We want to develop more cross-border case studies. We have an exceptionally dedicated team of students. This is largely student-led initiative, has very few faculty members involved, but it's students not just from one university, around 5 or 6 universities that we have represented, and they're working on this. So with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'd love to see the student engagement and thinking about how we can integrate them into our teams as well, which is absolutely critical to, I'm sure, all of the centers that we're representing in the work that we're talking about here. Next, we'll go to Dr. Eunice Imasiku from University of Zambia.
Thank you very much. Is it good morning, good afternoon to everyone, or is it, and perhaps others it's good evening. Yeah, as has been mentioned, I'm Eunice Imasiku and a lecturer at the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at the University of Zambia, and currently I'm heading the department. So in most cases, I teach courses that cover topics related to migration, courses such as GES 4165, which looks at migration, refugees, and environment, and also GES 5142, which looks at population dynamics and development. So I have discovered that as I teach these courses, there are certain topics that are interesting, though we haven't done so much research on migration, but at least I have had an opportunity of supervising undergraduate projects dealing with refugee-related issues such as the enviro and economic impact of refugee settlements on the host community. And at the moment, I'm supervising one student who is working on the migration, conflict, and climate change nexus. So looking at the fact that we have a number of people migrating currently in globally, that is, we are seeing an unprecedented number, or is it levels of migrants? We see that with such huge numbers of migrants, then we need to consider their health, and perhaps it is no wonder that migrant health has been recognized as a global public health priority. And this is one of those areas that we hope to work on with colleagues around here. As I was preparing for this, we had a chat with colleagues in the Department of Population Studies in the School of Humanities and Social Studies, as social sciences, and also the colleagues from the Department of Health, Police and Management in the School of Public Health, and also those in the Department of Health Promotion and Education. So looking at the discussions that we had, we identified that migration and health could be one of those topics which we can research on, so as to just see how this link between the two works out, because we realize that migrants are exposed to a number of issues that may have an impact on their health even as they migrate. Now I also discovered that actually our colleagues from the Department of Health Promotion and Education in the School of Public Health are trying to look at issues to do with the development of COVID-19 intervention strategies that will work for commercial sex workers and truck drivers in border towns of Zambia, as well as responsive sexual and reproductive health rights services for mobile commercial sex workers. So these are some of the themes which we can work together with and be able to see how best we can move forward this research agenda of migration and mobilities. So I think those are some of the issues that we can do. So for now, we haven't done so much perhaps in the area of migration when we look at the components of population change, in that fertility issues and mortality seem to have taken a leading role, but we are hoping to start collaborating with others. And I think this Salon is one of those, is a starting point for us, and we're hoping that with others who have made their presentations here, we could collaborate and see how best we can move this research agenda forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Imasiku. I'm excited for another panelist who's coming, Dr. Gunisha Kaur, in a minute to connect on the health topics, as well as, there's so much conversation here amongst all of you around gender and really important. Next, we'll go to Dr. Richard Mull at the University College of London.
There you go. Thank you very much. My name is Richard Mull. I'm a political sociologist at UCL. My research on migration and mobility analyzes the experiences of LGBTQ migrants and asylum seekers, looking at their specific sort of motivations and sort of problems. And in general, there's sort of an underrepresented group in migration research. My geographical focus is primarily Russia and Eastern Europe. I'm based at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, although I have been doing some research on Latin American migration to Europe. My most recent research in this field examined the different forms of persecution that queer people in Russia face from the state and from society, and as well as the narratives that LGBTQ asylum seekers need to produce in order to make their claims understandable to asylum adjudicators in the West, who have a very sort of localized understanding of queer identities. There's a link to an open access book that I edited on queer migration and asylum, which you're very welcome to look at. My research on queer asylum has also been used by lawyers in the US, the UK and Canada to help asylum seekers gain refugee status in those countries. UCL hosts a number of research centres on migration. The biggest is perhaps the Migration Research Unit, which is based in the Department of Geography. It comprises 40 researchers from different academic departments at the university, and together we run a popular MSc programme in global migration. The Department of Economics is home to CREAM, the Centre for Research and Analysis of Migration, which has been conducting primarily research on labour economics related to migration for sort of 20 years now. My own School of Slavonic and East European Studies hosts the Polish Migration Research Group. We have a website which is a valuable resource for anyone interested in migration to and from Poland. And every year we host a conference on various aspects of Polish migration. And finally, the Refuge in a Moving World Networks brings together experts from across UCL who work specifically on asylum, refugees, displacement, forced migration, exile and conflict. In terms of the question that I'm particularly interested in, or become particularly interested in recently as a result of the crisis in Ukraine, and one that I think would benefit from an interdisciplinary approach, is why some migrants and asylum seekers are considered more worthy than others. It's been particularly noticeable that in Europe, no effort has been spared to accommodate the waves of refugees fleeing Russian military attacks in Ukraine in a way that simply was not the case for Syrians fleeing Russian military attacks in their own homeland. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Absolutely, your geographic concentration and the pointedness of that last question is something that's definitely on all of our minds in this migrations and mobilities conversation. Next, we'll go to Dr. Brenda Yeo at the National University of Singapore.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this space to introduce the work of migration and mobilities from the Asian Migration Cluster, one of the multidisciplinary research clusters at the Asia Research Institute, which is part of the National University of Singapore. So let me first outline, I guess, what is our key challenge. This is not just to do with the rise of transnational migration in Asia in terms of volume and velocity, but definitely in terms of the social complexity as well as migration as a transformative force in the lives and livelihoods of people. There are distinctive features of Asian migration. It's very largely temporary secular migration. It's highly feminized, increasingly feminized. It's brokered, commercially brokered, and it's of course very much steeped in the migration and development discourse. So the key challenge for us is to try to develop conceptual insights on Asia from Asia, sort of to theorize from the South rather than just use the South as a testing ground for theories based on the experience of the North, as we wrote in a particular article a couple of years ago. So I'm just going to have time to introduce three conceptual themes that we are focusing on, and these also serve as sort of future directions that we are working towards. The first has to do with post-colonial nation building and temporary migration regime. So the context here is that large-scale labor migration in Asia basically started at a time when Asian countries are still very much in the process of nation building. So to cut a long story short, what happens is that Asian labor migration systems tend to be developed in a way to minimize the challenges to the fragile imaginary of the nation state. And they do this by keeping migration temporary. So temporary migration is the key regime in Asia. So the kinds of projects and questions that we look at are threefold. One, we are interested in linking enforced transience and what we call permanent temporariness to migrant precarity, stigmatization, the diminished access to social protection, and very importantly, the lack of pathways to residency and citizenship. Secondly, and this resonates with earlier presentations, that we're also interested not just in the so-called politics of integration and assimilation, but in fact the opposite, the politics of non-integration and spatial separateness in arrival cities, like housing construction workers, migrant construction workers in dormitories, for example. And with the onset of the pandemic, we are very interested in the way that the temporary migration regime, whether it's sustainable, because it very much depends on open borders and the churning of migrants to and fro. So is this still a sustainable system in pandemic times? Our second theme has to do with the feminization of migration, transnational family and cross-border marriages. And here we are interested in the increasing feminization of migration in Southeast Asia in particular, that's very much linked to gender-segmented global demand for care and domestic work, as well as a parallel stream of migration to do with the regional demand for female marriage migrants to fill care deficits or bride deficits in the more advanced economies in the region. So here we have two sets of projects and questions. One is to rethink the gender division of labor in the provisioning of everyday and generational care in the migrant-sending societies. So in other words, if mothers are now the primary breadwinners as migrants, what happens to care work at home? Do the men step up to it? How do they perform masculinity in order to, in a sense, take on the care work in the vacuum? We're also interested in long distance care work performed by the women abroad, digital communications, and the gender politics of care. So a second theme to do with marriage migration, cross-border marriage migration, has to do with the family and questions of familial citizenship. Many of these marriage migrants gain citizenship through the vehicle of the family. And we are also interested in migration and diversity in terms of mixed race identity politics amongst the next generation. And the third and last theme has to do with transnational mobilities and how that is, in a sense, channeled and facilitated by the migration industry or the migration infrastructure. So as I mentioned earlier on, in Asia, migration is a heavily mediated process that involves sort of a diverse set of actors, including sponsors, recruiters, placement agents, and other commercial brokers. So this perspective shifts attention to those who move migrants rather than just the migrants themselves. Of course, it's important to look at migrant agency, but the thinking here is that we also need to look at the sort of broader infrastructures that makes mobility possible, and therefore, in a sense, help us understand how migrant mobility is constituted, how it's channeled, how it's constrained. So here we have two sets of questions, one to do with conceptualizing the role of migration industry, the commercial brokers vis-a-vis the state, in moving migrants across borders. And a general thought here is that the state basically outsources some of the migration governance functions to the migration industry as a way of cost saving, as well as sometimes to blame, to escape blame, to avoid blame. I mean, who's usually vilified is usually the commercial brokers, right? But the commercial brokers basically serves the interests of the state. And a second set of projects has to do with knowledge mobility infrastructure and how this enables, constraints or channels student or academic mobilities. And this resonates with some of the work mentioned earlier on. We are working around China's Belt and Road Initiative and how this, in a sense, reshapes tertiary educational spaces in Asia, sort of away from the West and centering on China. And with the rise of the pandemic, we're also very interested in the way that the pandemic and pandemic times have reshaped the higher education landscape. So thank you for that. And sorry if I've gone over time because I can't see the time. So.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yo. And also just a quick reminder before I move to our last panelist, to our audience, to please share your Q&A, your thoughts, links to your centers and your work in the Q&A function so that we will be able to pose those questions to our panelists as well. And finally, Dr. Gunisha Kaur from Cornell University.
Thank you so much for having me today, and thank you everybody for presenting your work. I think this was with every speaker, I was just so excited to hear what everybody's doing and just looking towards the areas of collaboration. So I'm going to present my role in human rights and medicine. I'm a physician and human rights researcher based at Weill Cornell Medicine, which is Cornell's campus in New York City. I'm director of the Human Rights Impact Lab and co-medical director of the Weill Cornell Center for Human Rights, which is a student-run, faculty-supervised clinic working with asylum seekers who are looking for legal status in the U.S. And I'm a faculty fellow with the Einaudi Center for International Studies, which really there's great work and synergy with the Cornell Migrations Initiative through these cross-campus research projects and growth. So up until now, trauma experienced by forcibly displaced individuals has largely been thought of as fixed from a medical perspective. If somebody has PTSD or depression or chronic somatic pain from their torture or persecution, those effects are largely thought of as being fixed and unchangeable. In our lab, the Human Rights Impact Lab, what we're studying is how such trauma can be mitigated or potentially even reversed. So if we have a patient in front of us in New York City who has arrived as a refugee from Central or South America or Southeast Asia or Europe, can we treat their physical and psychological sequela of torture? Can we, for example, decrease chronic debilitating physical pain that an individual experiences, or can we reduce the number of flashbacks that cripple them daily? I think many of us in the room here would agree, I think all of us would agree that migration is really the issue of our time, but the approach in most countries has been to sort of ignore and hope that the problem of migrants coming into new countries will go away, that borders and walls will protect status quo as it is. And I think what we're seeing is that people are coming, climate change is increasing those flows. And when people arrive to their host country, there has to be a way to advance their health and well-being. And to investigate how this trauma can be reversed, our lab has taken an approach that expands beyond clinical research expands to the medical legal realm, to digital technologies, and even to omics. So we're taking sort of a very unique and innovative approach within medicine. Our research team includes students, resident physicians, biostatisticians, junior and senior faculty. Each of our faculty has a different area of expertise, from digital tools to epigenetics research. So we're really fostering within our research group junior investigators who are really cross-disciplinary. They're learning how to do clinical research using digital technologies, or omics research and digital technologies. So it's really a very generative group and forum. Our goal is to create a paradigm shift in how people think about migration, refugees, and health, particularly in host countries. So for example, we're redefining language used in medicine in terms of refugee trauma. We're investigating new treatment modalities. We're running clinical research and clinical trials to see how we can actually improve the lives of these individuals and rehabilitate them. And we're presenting these ideas in unique ways for medicine. For example, through this graphic perspective in the New England Journal of Medicine. Typically, research articles in medicine are very dense and might not reach a broad readership, and we're trying to shift that. And then in that vein, really bringing this work to the public, because we think there's an opportunity to shift public opinion and public policy around refugees using the platform of medicine to demonstrate how the health and well-being of refugees is inextricably tied to our own health and well-being. So when I think about the future of this research, I think this is, the future is quite bright. I think we're just in this room, we've demonstrated how different disciplines can come together and harness their own research potential to create sort of revolutionary collaborations that advance the health and well-being of refugees. And I think as we think about how to collaborate, that's really what I would hope for us together.
Thank you so much, Gunisha, and all of you for these really fascinating, important, timely, and collaborative perspectives on the work that you do and that remains to be done. I'm going to pose 2 questions to our panelists, and then please just raise your hands. If you want to say something to respond to something that someone else has said, please feel free to raise your hands amongst the panelists. The first question is from one of our Cornell colleagues, Dr. Karim Ali Qassam, who's in the Department of Natural Resources and also the Peace and Conflict Studies program. And he asks, can circular migration be envisioned as a policy response to address conflict, food, and livelihood security, as well as peace building? So for many of you who are looking at circular migration, how do we see it as something that's not only a response to particular types of conditions, but maybe a proactive response potentially to address climate and conflict and peace building opportunities. Another question that I have is thinking about the intersection that many of you have mentioned between policy, healthcare, well-being, and legal status. One of Gunisha's collaborators, Stephen Yealer, who is in the Cornell Law School, works on immigration and asylum law and protections. And so thinking about this space for how your work can connect to that kind of the health and well-being, along with policy protections and the like, whether or not there's a space for that in your work as well. So anyone who wants to take up those questions or respond to something that your colleagues have said here, points of intersection that you've noticed.
I could respond to the question on circular migration, since temporary migration is certainly a very important aspect of Asian migrations. So my view is that temporary migration is the main keystone of the migration and development discourse, as it is seen as the triple win, the win-win-win panacea to development. But there is another side of the coin is not so whilst it is certainly a pathway to development for many migrants, it's also not entirely without many issues that it also calls into being. For example, it is very extractive of labor at low cost in host societies. So host societies basically do not pay for the social reproduction of the labor, but extracts the labor at low cost. And for sending societies, it's basically creates a sort of dependency on remittances that can, in a sense, be very problematic. And for the migrant themselves, we must remember that whilst they're able to move, social protection and safety nets do not move. So many of them are not able to, in a sense, carry the social protection mechanisms with them from sending to host countries. So in a sense, there's a need to look at more portable social protection or even citizenship sort of rights. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Dr. Tay.
So I would just add a little to what Brenda has already said eloquently. So in West Africa or Africa per se, secular migration is part of livelihoods, and it can help improve livelihoods where people move, especially from rural to urban areas. And it's part of why South-South migration is important, because they move for short distances. In recent years, we also do see people moving across to the Middle East. And the issues that Brenda has already talked about, what I think is really important is for governments to facilitate some of these flows and to ensure that like social security portability and other issues are addressed in secular migration agreements between countries, and also giving information to the would-be migrants. Protection issues are discussed with the migrants. I think those are policy issues that we will need to address if we want to ensure that it is useful to improving livelihoods. Thank you.
Absolutely, and you have an important perspective there in terms of thinking about mobility within ECOWAS versus beyond the West African Organization of States. That's in some ways parallel to the EU, but in other ways quite different. So the regional perspectives in those bodies are very important to think about neighboring migrations as well across these kind of, as one of our panelists said, borders as a violent frontiers of state construction. I want to go to Deepan as well, and then to Kristen.
No, I mean, see, more than looking at, so the questions of legality and largely concerned of those with respect to access to basic amenities, I think that is something which we've been trying to look at. And there's a lot within, let's say, India about the biometrification of identity, which makes access to basic amenities possible, right? And a lot of that process by itself is very exclusionary, which makes it makes refugees out of those as part of the vulnerable safety net. So just to give you an example, and for those, any relief measures that the government announced as part of the COVID pandemic could not go into almost 85 to 90% of the migrant workforce, which was out on the streets walking barefoot, for the simple reason that there is no way that the relief could have been provided, because all that the government has tried to institute are mechanisms through which most of these workers are excluded out of the process by trying to show 5 documents to get 1 identity. And that's a big, big concern at this point of time. So I hope that through cross-border studies, we can build a more strong and robust policy advocacy network. And I think one of the ways that we've seen it's worked is media publications really help, but visual coverage has got us into the foot door of many. If you show a video of 4 or 5 narratives coming out, but you have to keep the integrity of the work and the scholarship, I think it really helps sort of take the conversation forward to some of the issues. In fact, I mean, the Rohingya case, I think most of you would know about, of the refugees crisis in Bangladesh. So we're trying very hard right now to get a sense of the refugee camps of Rohingya community in Assam, which most people are not aware about, but there are thousands present. So just on this.
Thank you so much. And Kristen.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to echo and agree with my colleagues in terms of the concepts that they were mentioning that are very important in terms of circular migration, and that I found similarities or bridges with Latin America. I'm thinking here about the Venezuelan migration, which is a migration which is highly mobile. And I'm speaking about mobility between countries across the continent, walking in groups with families, children, women, men, and they walk from Venezuela to Colombia, down to Ecuador, Peru, Chile, and they move back up after some time in Chile. They move back up to Peru, they settle in Peru for a while, go back up to Ecuador. And this sort of mobility, I think, is very distinct from other mobilities that you find in developed nations. So I think it's interesting to talk about that particularity that we see now in Latin America and other areas of the Global South. And I agree with everything that they said, that the issues here are of this sort of migration. Social protection is very important to talk about. Livelihood, the stability of that livelihood. Citizenship, because it's mostly illegal migration. And so citizenship comes forward as one of the most important debate in addition to social protection. I think one of the most challenging issues here, and I go back to public policy, is the lack of coordination that we find among countries when we talk about this sort of circular mobility, but across borders, across nations. And I think it's particularly challenging for Latin America in this sense, because there are different laws in each country that they move through, and the challenges change from country to country. And so there's a lack of coordination in terms of public policy to help this mobility and bring forward these questions in terms of social protection, legality, employment, family reunification, or dignified family life. And so all those questions are brought forward, but within, I think, the context of a lack of coordination in terms of public policy within the government. So migration governance also comes into to dialogue here with the circular migration. Thank you very much.
Those are fantastic points to close with, and really charts the agenda ahead, as all of you have done in your individual presentations. But really, we see that there's so much room for this research, for these topics to be communicated effectively, and the need to address in a very interdisciplinary and intersectional way. The attention here to gender is quite clear across age cohorts, across nationalities, and marginalized populations within countries. And so we thank you all so much for your contributions. We look forward to continuing the conversation. We'll have different channels and mediums for that to continue. And please stay tuned for our next gathering. Thank you all so much.